to Yugoslavia. First, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for not speaking correctly because I never learned the language well, because I never knew which variant to use. I'll give trouble to the translators primarily. You kind audience, you listen to me carefully. The review I'm working with is dealing with repatriation of population of Yugoslavia, supposed to go to Third Reich. I called it displaced Yugoslavia. I will first focus my intervention on Serbian forced workers, which is hard because I'm working on Yugoslavia and for repatriation from Jasenice, Trst and Subotica. I will not deal with the repatriation of collaborationists in Slovenia or POWs of Western forces, for example, Slovenians waging war for Italy, nor the repatriation of Volksdeutscher, the repatriation of Aegean and Macedonia, or the internal repatriation, that is, war refugees within Yugoslavia. This is not what I'm dealing with, just to explain to you the context of people moving around these areas. What is displaced Yugoslavia? I make a difference between displaced persons. For me, displaced country is what I'm interested in. It's a country that during the war did not exist anymore. That was Yugoslavia. Essentially, what I'm asking myself is whether this country exists in the heads of the people who went to Germany. I'm referring to the new edition of the journal of the Hannah Levi Haas. She kept during her stay in Bergen-Belsen, which was important for her everyday survival, how this idea did not find a correlation in the Yugoslav society after her return in 1945. But my intervention will not, unfortunately, deal with the psychological, cultural projections. This will be the other side of the coin of the human life, real material problems of return in 1945. But these projections were not mentioned without reason, as it was quoted in a document of the People's Front in 1945. Milan Grohl said more or less the entire story will be around characteristics, profiling in English would be a good term. The role of profiling and political and moral behavior during the time in Germany will have a great role for repatriates as well as Yugoslav citizens in the first year after the war. What you did, how you behaved, who can be your witness, where do you come from. On this, your rights to pension, career, school, sometimes treatment depended on characteristics. Profiling was necessary, but to what extent it depended on the profession and the work supply. Former officers of the Yugoslav People's Army, the HR captain of the Ministry of Public Defense in 1945, thought so. Also for doctors and civil servants, it depended it depended on the profession. There is a good publication about the characteristics in 45-46, how teachers, it is easier for teachers than accountants. School teachers with not great characteristics will be better off than accountants, for example. Let's see what was the state policy around repatriation. First in democratic federal Yugoslavia, and then in Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. There were three stages to the government policy of repatriation, according to me. I called the first phase humanitarian repatriation. In September 1944 until April 1945, the Committee for Repatriation was functional with the Social Policy Secretariat and Public Health, and with the international organization. The second phase is analytical mass repatriation. The humanitarian repatriation under suspicion began in April of 1945, when the State Commission for Repatriation, with the administrative body, the Section for Repatriation, with the Ministry of Social Policy, with the executive body as the headquarters for repatriation within the ministry, between the Ministries of Social Policy and Defense. The Commission for Repatriation worked on an international plane in cooperation with international organizations. The third phase is political repatriation. After the Ministry of Social Policy was dissolved and started, the Committee for Social Care was Social Welfare was formed. In April 1946, the 2 months period for applying for repatriation was started, after which Yugoslav citizens would be lost. Starting to talk again about characteristics, I have to go back to the time while repatriates were still in camps. There were illegal committees formed in the camps by political prisoners who provided assistance to one another. More often those that were political prisoners than those that were not. Buchenwald Committee was well known. The Committee of Dachau, several members were processed in 48 in Dhaka-related proceedings. And there were committees in Norway, Mauthausen. There were committees among workers in labor camps, among prisoners of war. I feel that POWs as well are forced laborers, because the Geneva Convention that may turn the forced workers into POWs did not function always in the best way. Then these committees for POWs were formed already in autumn 1941 during the Nuremberg Declaration, when a large number of the generals and officers of the former Royal Army of Yugoslavia enabled Yugoslavs to change according to ethnic criteria. Milan Bartoš said before the University of Law of Belgrade, when he returned from captivity. With the Nuremberg Declaration, these generals and officers confirmed that only Yugoslav POWs were against Germany, and that Serbs, Croats, and so on were not. So Germans made a difference between Jewish officers and Serbs, and sent Hungarians, Bulgarians, and Romanians home. There were ethnicities that were still considered themselves Yugoslavs, and they were not returned like Croats, Slovenians, and Bulgarians. They were kept as Yugoslav detainees. So there was pro-Yugoslavian communists on one side, and pro-German oriented on the other, and this division became realistic as well, because those that were pro-Yugoslavian were put together with the Jews in one side of the camp, isolated from others. Merin also wrote about this in his book Goodbye October. And there was a film made with him as screenplay writer. After the liberation, all these committee grew from camps and became main organizations for repatriation, especially in the liberation zones that were liberated by America, France, and England. The Yugoslav POWs went around Germany looking for people who wanted to come back to the country, for Tito, for Yugoslavia. It was similar with members of the committee of political prisoners, prisoners of the Buchenwald camp that covered the entire territory of Germany. The propaganda was pro-Yugoslavian. They listed characteristics of repatriates and referred them accordingly in stations in Vienna, Paris, Budapest, Prague, Soviet Union, and later on Berlin. Trains were organized and provisions distributed for them. The committees against Tito and pro-King and committees for Croatian, Slovenians and similar were also organized and constituted after the arrival of Quisling formations that managed to escape Yugoslavia before the end of the war. These people were mixed together and propagated against Tito. After the dissolution of the Democratic Federative Republic of Yugoslavia and creation of the People's Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, these committees, anti-Yugoslavian committees, got even international support. Within this climate, we need to see the humanitarian, the second stage of repatriation under suspicion. Now the Yugoslav government had to check who these people were. Are they really repatriates, or they were somebody who wanted to create chaos in the country? Until June 1945, repatriation went only through Vojvodina because the northwest part of the country was still in war. So all people who were liberated the east part of the Third Reich were returned through Budapest to Subotica. Until the end of June, 80,000 people went through Vojvodina, and through Subotica alone, 60,000. They were followed by the Red Army that often recruited the liberated POWs and young deputies and made back ground troops out of them. So the people who that returned through Subotica until the capitulation of Germany were already characterized by the Red Army. Red Army would direct them to Subotica, being very careful to not have any Germans enter together with them. In Subotica there were difficulties because the Yugoslav army was still waging war on the terrain, and the guards were most often Hungarians, did not know a word of Serbo-Croat language. These people who were young and did not know what was going on in Yugoslavia were very cruel towards repatriates. There wasn't enough food, and a lot of people could not get home because some territories were still under conflict, so they stayed in the reception centers for a long time. Vojvodina succeeded in rescuing some victims of the Holocaust and directed them to Belgrade, where there was a reception center for Jews here. In May, the second phase started, and so the first wave of repatriates started working. They moved Hungarians and put the repatriates in their place. And they were put there to listen to interview, and they filtered the next wave of repatriates. So that was the majority of characteristics in the period. The following repatriation bases were opened in Belgrade. There was a center, then in Novi Sad, Subotica, that was the largest, with the 168 staff. In Pančevo, Ruma, Kikinda, Ilias, Pazova, Sremski Karlovci, Petrovaradin, Beršac, Bela, Crkva, Mramor, and Kovin. These are all places in mostly Vojvodina. The problem is that the staff in reception centers stole their possessions, abused them, let them go without food for a week. Many people complained. The headquarters for repatriation was asked to improve the situation, and they said that any harassment was propaganda for the enemy. In June, there was a second entry. I called it express entry across Jesenice. In July 45, after the agreement between the government and Allied forces, Ljubljana, Zagreb, South Serbia railroad tracks transported people all the way to Bulgaria. At the end of August, only through Vojvodina to remain in Serbia, 150,000 people moved. Only in Belgrade, 15,000. The highest numbers were in October. Overall, 330,000 Yugoslavs, 125,000 POWs, 85,000 interned persons, 80,000 workers, and forced workers, most often, and 40,000 other persons, mostly moved Slovenian families. In October 1945, 20,000 people in Germany and in Austria, 11,000 in Egypt, and several groups in France, Switzerland, and people from eastern Slovenia, from the coastline, that were captured by Allied forces. There's another 6,000 of them in Marseille. 29th November 1945 started the third phase of repatriation that I called political one. In January, the number of Yugoslavia changed in Germany. It wasn't 20,000 anymore, it was all of a sudden 40,000. Who remained 22,000 in camps, 80,000 outside of camps. Until 1947, another 18,000 will return. So 330 plus 18,000 until the end of 47. Nearly 350,000. But the statistics do not mention forced laborers, but voluntary laborers now. From 1946 onward, I didn't understand well enough. On the one hand, it can be that forced workers return quickly because they had a clear conscience because they were forced, but those that stayed, they were voluntary workers. They didn't know what would happen to them if they returned. On the other hand, under Stalinist principles, It could be that a forced worker in 1946 becomes voluntary worker, and it's recorded as such in the records. I need to examine this more. Camps in Germany were there were fights, open support from England and the States. Aleš Bebler talked about this publicly on the UNA conference in London 1946. So people were prevented of returning by force. As for voluntary workers that went to Germany and stayed there, if they worked in factories, they were often became political in Germany because they heard comments from their peers, and throughout Germany the show Free Yugoslavia, which was broadcasted by Radio Moscow, it was a show that was broadcast every day. It was spread around when Italy felt there was great celebrations in camps in Germany. The news got there. And victory, national resistance of partisans, so people in factories were quite political and most often returned. It was different for those living in villages and working in agriculture. Little companies, they may have lived with Germans and they listened anti-communist propaganda. They might have even, at the end of the Second World War, they maybe even stole the tractor of the German family. They couldn't decide whether to go back with the tractor because they heard things are getting stolen in Yugoslavia, so they would decide to stay in Germany maybe. They didn't know what to do. So this perception of what was going on in Yugoslavia was very important. Serbian sent 80% back home. 5% were sent to the army. In Croatia, 80% of repatriates went to the army. Forced workers were often treated as second-class Yugoslavs because they did not fight like partisans. This fact came out of the interviews and memories of returnees. Dr. Vladislav Schwartz, who came back from Mauthausen, talked about his fight with Milovan Đilas. Milovan Đilas wanted to put him in the Ministry of National Health, and he said, I can't do it now, I have to recover, let me go home. And Đilas would tell him, what are you tired from? You didn't fight, you only lay around in Germany. This is one of those stories. What else I could say? The first revision started of the characteristics with the proceedings in 1947 in the popular committees could not define the characteristics, and there were dilemmas around who authored the characteristics, and it spread around. It went to the committees, the first Dachau committee and the proceedings. They helped one another, they wrote down these characteristics, came into the state apparatus and sabotaged it. The similar proceedings happened in each of the committees. Norway, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Vienna, committees created there. But it was difficult for me to find all the materials as a foreigner in Austria. After this, for example, in 1947 and 51, this rhetoric around people who fought in Germany Šta беше Subnor, majke? After that, the characteristics were elaborated even further. The Fourth Congress in 1961 was constituted in the Subnor, which is the Association of Veterans of wars, and this was actually the rhetoric of the part.
And so, come up with questions. A question for Sanela, because she's working in Nuremberg, and there was probably the largest prisoner of war camp. The Nuremberg Declaration has stated of Doctrines 13b. Did you record any contacts between the workers from Serbia with prisoners of war? So far, no. I've not found any documents that would record any contact. As for generally prisoners of war, there are very few documents in Nuremberg about them. This is simply a topic that is still under-researched. I still hope, and I'm looking for them, but the only group of prisoners of war that I've come up with is soldiers who were in work in villages in agriculture, but only around 20 of them. They were alone. Where I found them, I didn't find any Serbian workers. In Nuremberg itself, yes, they could have been in contact, but that's possible. But as I know, the prisoners of war went out of the camps partly, but we so far don't have any documents about that. With regard to the separation of communists, you said Yugoslavs, so prisoners of war. And you mentioned the separation of the group of Jews and Yugoslavs, that's what you call them. It was, in fact, a result of an intervention by General Nedic. He asked, through the military commander, due to the influence of Jews and communists, to separate those who have a bad influence on the other prisoners. So indeed, they were separated as a special group. So Jews and communists, not Jews and Yugoslavs. That was the ideological label. And as you know, in the Nuremberg camp, they were a separated group, and in Osnabrück as well. Mr. Vinaver also wrote about this. There are several sources on this. But there is also this direct plea, so to say, by General Nedic. I think it's been printed, published in Bane Božović's book on the suffering of Jews in Serbia. As for the work by the prisoners of war, it refers to the soldiers, not to officers. That is very well known. According to the Geneva Convention, it's referred only to soldiers, which for the majority of them was a favorable circumstance because they worked in farms, and many of them have made friendly contacts with the people they worked for. There are examples of even relationships. But this was sanctioned by law. Professor Ristovic has a book about the private life. I have an article about camps, and I listed several examples about how some prisoners had this friendly status. I stated one prisoner who was integrated in the German surroundings, so he sang in the church choir. He became part of the family. He created children with this family where he worked in. It was not a rule, but it wasn't rare either. Thank you for the comment. Yes, as far as I read the intervention by Milan Bartoš, he said that by dividing Yugoslavs by ethnic criteria, these generals and officers who were for Nedic, they no longer looked for support. They seem not to know about the Geneva Convention. They said, okay, we don't want to be prisoners of war. We've come here for because of those who have made a coup in Yugoslavia. They say they are communists, but they are registered as Yugoslavs. They were blamed for war. The others said, we as Serbs, we are not guilty, we are not to blame. We as Croats, we are not guilty. So that's one thing. As for the officers also had to work. That is against the Geneva Convention. For the soldiers to work, that is normal. That every prisoner of war works, but for an officer to work, that wasn't recognized under the Geneva Convention. But in the first months, even officers were sent to work. And they started to read and write about the Geneva Convention because no one had told them about the Geneva Conventions. Otto Bih, Ali Merin, and Karevanovic, and so on. As for women, for example, a soldier who found a woman in Germany and wanted to return with the German woman, the woman didn't want to go back. If she was Polish and Dutch, but the German couldn't go back. If they married there, they stayed in Germany. There were many cases in which they were not longer classified as prisoners of war, but they were sent to a prison, to Germensheim, and forwarded to a camp in Buchenwald. They would lose the status of prisoner of war and were sent to Ordorf, where they were shot as flies. That's what I wanted to say. I had two questions, one for Thomas and the other for the, this memorialization that we saw in your presentation. One refers, if I understood correctly, about the memorial in the place where the barracks were set to fire, and the other is you signed it with a memorial to those who worked on the construction of the railway or roads. Whose initiative was it, and in which period were the memorials built? This depends on the memorial we are talking about, but this is a period after the war, during the Yugoslav era. But recently, in 2011, Milan was there in one sub-camp, Vesjoren, where the majority, before they set the barracks on fire, some 250 prisoners were selected who seemed to be healthy. I don't know exactly the criteria, and they took them to another camp. And in 2011, they erected a monument there. But what's interesting about these monuments is the debate about communists and non-communists. If you read the text of the monument, it's the old history, so to say. What is problematic here is that, yes, there was a large contingent of persons who were caught in fighting. The majority were with the partisans, that was clear. But particularly for the independent state of Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia, there were many civilians sent there. So now there is a debate about memorialization. What should represent them? Because in the last one that you saw, there is a partisan star, the red star. There is this narrative, and now this is becoming more relative. Microphone. There were many initiatives. The society was set up in late 60s of Yugoslav-Norwegian friendship, and in Gornji Milanovac there is the Norwegian House, is one seat, and there is another seat in Norway. How involved were they in building of these monuments? I don't know exactly when all these monuments were erected, so I can't answer correctly. I'd like to add something, as my colleague Dulic are engaged on the new permanent exhibition in the Norwegian House in Gornji Milanovac. I hope it will include something about memorialization. The Yugoslav president, Josip Broz Tito, really put a lot of significance to it. I hope there's one of these monuments. One of these monuments was opened in the 60s. It was at the top level of government. And there are records of it, also films. And here we have only photos. Then it continued into the 70s and the 80s and the 2000s. And then there was, it was all suspended when Yugoslavia broke up and when it was disassembled. I don't know which word to use there. But as my colleague Dulic mentioned, one monument was erected in 2011 near Narvik, one of the smaller camps. But if it was smaller, doesn't mean that the suffering was smaller. This year, a series of markings were made. There is the so-called blood route, which has become a symbol, and the highest importance was given to it. It was attended by the Norwegian king, and the high delegation, top-level delegation from Serbia attended. Just to go into details about it, how it works in the end, because there are always problems when it comes to from our side about memorialization. But really great significance was given to it as from the Norwegian side, from our side as well, and it is an ongoing thing. You mean that the Norwegian king came and the president of Serbia didn't have time to attend? That's the issue. There was a discrepancy in the representation level. Well, Norway is far away. I apologize. I wanted to ask something. Your presentation was really, Mr. Dulic was really impressive. However, statistically, did you manage to establish out of internees in Norway, how many were partisans? Which percentage were the fighters of partisan units from Serbia and Croatia compared to other prisoners of war who were in the camps that you mentioned? Thank you. And when you asked me, I have to answer what is a partisan. In Ljuba Mlađenović's book, The Code Name Viking, he was internee himself and collected a lot of information about it. He claims that there were 1,600 members of SKOI, the communist youth. Were they members before they entered camp, or they become when they entered the camp? It was very surprising, I'd say. Perhaps not, depending on our perception, but the party was really active in the camp. They really had party activities there, intensive party activities. We can see that particularly in the exile in Sweden. They get an argument with the ambassador. He writes to a Swedish institution for social protection, don't put them in university cities because they only make propaganda for communism and so on. I'd say this. Whose status was it? After the war, also, there was a motive with the prisoners, among other things, to present them as partisans. They had some benefit from it. We cannot know exactly, but of those who were really, so we can monitor this by German sources, those who were arrested in Serbia by the Germans, those who were treated as some sort of what we could call today unlawful combatants. They were not protected under Geneva Conventions, and the absolute majority of them were partisans, that was clear. But there was a big group of civilians. Whether they were partisan sympathizers, so where do we put the limit? It's really difficult. I'd like to go back to refer to Professor Colin. We recently found an information. You found an information. One gentleman who said that he was a Chetnik. I listed this in one article. And it turns out that he lied, that he was a partisan. Why we still don't know. Are there any other questions? When certain controversial events happened about the renewal of monuments which were erected in the 60s, which are part of the official socialist narrative, as was mentioned already. Recently, it led to certain tensions in the ranks of the Croatian immigration in Norway and Serbian immigration. There were certain they had certain problems with it, and I'm interested. One of the persons who was really displeased with it pointed out something that was really controversial, and I wanted to hear your comment. That among prisoners there were many members of the Hunter Division who, after the insurrection in France, were transferred to camps in Norway, and they were never on the list of those who perished in the camps in Norway. I cannot claim, I fully understand if they were there, why weren't they not included in the list? But I'm interested in your opinion because I don't know how much I should trust this source. And another question is for Sanela and concerns those transnational individuals who this is the open controversy, Yugoslav and Serbian individuals as forced labor in Germany and were in fact brought from France. We know that these former fighters in the Spanish Civil War and prisoners in southern France chose the route through Germany as a way of returning to Yugoslavia. And then Lazar Udovicki, who was member of the French resistance, when he was arrested, was transferred to prison and then was included as a forced laborer to one of those labor camps. These transfers, you said, from Serbia. Perhaps we could think about including those individuals coming from other territories. Okay, let me answer. I read this article, but I don't remember all the details, so I don't quite understand it. As for this group, it was really confusing about which category it belongs to. I mentioned that there were other people, there were other deserters, other people who were in other camps. But when we talk about, and it's really important, we have to distinguish the groups. We are talking about those deported from Yugoslavia because they opposed to the occupation regime. Then this does not belong to this group, so it's not included. Just as thought workers were not included because they formally had contracts to 250, 300 of them. There are German records showing that a good deal of them, they were Slovenians, Croats, and others from Vojvodina. They worked for a while, that they went for a holiday, and they frequently didn't go back to Norway afterwards, but they had a labor contract and they were persecuted for breaking this contract. And the problem was people not coming back from holiday. And this group, as far as I remember, related to the Hunter Division, they would be treated as deserters in the German sense. It's another group, and it's really important. As for this controversy, there is an interesting aspect, since the Germans in their files would list as Serbs, and the majority of this group were around 90 ethnic Serbs, whether from the occupied Serbia or from the independent state of Croatia, but ethnic Serbs. That's what they believed to be. So the Norwegians later call this camps for Serbs, which is factographically wrong. I always say camps for Yugoslavs. They were not only Serbs, although the majority were Serbs. So now, after the wars in the 90s, there is a huge confusion about it. There's also Cyrillic alphabet. Also in this article, I mentioned in the context in which I'm not involved, the monument erected, there is a text explaining what happened to them in Cyrillic alphabet. When I saw this, I was not involved in this process. I said, I believe that this should not be so, because they were Yugoslavs. I would choose Latin alphabet. They were partisans. The official alphabet for partisans was Latin alphabet. So Norwegians, when I told them, they said, okay, they find the Cyrillic alphabet exotic. So they didn't want to say anything with it. It seemed cool to them to use Cyrillic alphabet. But today it creates controversy, and we have to be really sensitive to that. It was a serious issue, so there are huge debates, and now it's a bit passé, so to say, but about this commemoration Professor Koinen attended, there was a discussion. The Croatian ambassador didn't attend for some reason. No, it was Bosnian ambassador and the Macedonian. Okay, that's interesting, not to say exotic in itself. And the inscription is in Cyrillic, in Serbian, and there was also an inscription in Norwegian, so that Norwegians can read very well what it's about. And about the Cyrillic, there was a priest, of course, as well, the Orthodox priest. Yes, that's another interesting form as for the discussion of the culture of memory. There were many atheists in the group, and in this ceremony, they also invited an Orthodox priest and Muslim imam, and they made it into a religious ceremony. I was really skeptical, and it's interesting. There is a secular organization which organizes interments and burials and weddings, but it makes them into a ritual. So I said, okay, if we have all these religious representatives, so you should call them, because many of them were not religious at all. So there's a complex situation, but it's a it's a part of the reinterpretation, which creates huge problems because they ended up for completely different reasons that today it is represented. Not all of them, but really a good deal of them. A good deal of them, and when they're in the spirit of in Yugoslav spirit. But now it's presented that it's in the Serbian spirit, which was not the case. There was not such a division then. Another element, just to add, in addition to this Yugoslav spirit, there was this international spirit. They consider themselves to be part of the anti-fascist front, and that's how they saw themselves. That you can see that in the commemorations. We can talk a lot about Norway, our prisoners there, but it's interesting because there are many historical sources about it, and we can tell this story in great detail. Stojanovic, one of the prisoners, wrote a Norwegian Serbian dictionary so that they can communicate with Norwegians who were really held our prisoners very favorably. And he wrote the first Norwegian Serbo-Croatian dictionary. It's a really interesting topic, but we'll leave it for another time.
Let me answer your question. Until now, I only had the time to look at the files that said Serbia for files, but the next one I will go back to the archives and look first at the files that say Croatia, because in these there are also many Serbian workers, but I also plan to look at all other foreign workers just to be able to compare the living conditions as far as we can see from these files. I will try to remember your idea and look whether with the French there were our people from former Yugoslavia who moved through France to Nuremberg. Thank you very much for your suggestion. A small addition, yes, there must be a difference here. Country they come from, an ethnicity, also the confusion arises there. But essentially, in the files I'm looking at, they say country or they come from. Actually, where the transport comes from. That's the stamp they get, and then they describe each person individually as what they declare themselves and what their religion is. In my group from Serbia, we have essentially the majority are Orthodox, but there are two Muslims and one Catholic and several evangelists. Yes. Do we have any more questions? If there aren't, I think it's not a must. We've worked intensively today. For me, I'm thinking about something. I don't have an answer to it. It may sound naive, maybe even interesting. And this is the following. When we're talking about memorialization, we know when we're talking about socialist Yugoslavia that the focus was on fighters, anti-fascist fighters. So there is this important and complex memory of those combatants, and on the other hand, victims in camps for various reasons. They're all in one basket, so to say, of fascist victims of fascism. In a country with a prevailing ideology fighting against exploitation of one man over another, how is it possible that there is no deeper form of memorialization of the greatest form of exploitation, and this is forced labor? We know that, for example, when we're talking about Bor, I always go back to Bor, but I keep coming back to Bor because we'll visit it tomorrow. There were some monuments, schools visited the locations, but the victims of this camp are not defined much differently than the victims of other camps. They're again victims of fascist terror. There's no differentiation in this respect either. Maybe one of the directions of future research could be this. Anyway, I would like to thank all of you. Maybe if I can give one comment. This is an interesting question, but if we look at what happened after the war, it would be a great problem if we say that the labor exploitation is a great evil, which of course it is. The regime that would need to manifest and commemorate this also abused people through forced work, then it's for them it's better not to talk about it at all, maybe not to create additional problems. There's another aspect that Professor Ristovic touched upon today. A worker in the factory of plane motors are working because they need to feed their family, not because they want to work for Germans. But now they could be said that they're collaborationists. There's a story about Janka Stokic who performed for Germans. She was an actress, and she would say that the bakers were not traitors because they baked bread, and I am because I'm doing my job. So distinction between people who really did forced labor, but there's this gray zone. People who went to Germany, what were their motives? Adventure, to feed their family, whether they went to escape recruitment or to save their lives. A Pandora box of motives is opened there, and it was probably easier to avoid getting into that and just calling them all victims of fascism. I'm not convinced by this answer really, because, for example, the so-called communist regime never talked about the repression after war and crimes. They did not talk about some things and they used others to reaffirm their ideology. Yes, they did this in a way, because if we look at the results of the Committee for the Investigation of War Crimes, then the Repertory Committee, they found so many workers, hours, and the value in millions and billions of dollars. They manipulated it, to one extent, and then they didn't want to go into the nuances, semi-forced, forced, voluntary, and so on. That was one of the issues they would not tackle, because it would interfere with the strongholds of power, actually. The issue of character of the collectivization of labor on the fascist basis, the type of collectivization of work in the Nedić's ideology, German Reich, this populist collectivistic spirit that was propagated above all, and making of a semi-socialist community under the Nazism, and here under Nedić is structurally, actually, ethically different than what came afterwards. Collectivization had an early period where the country until 1947, 8 or 9 did not have other options. There was poor yield, there was hunger for nearly 5 years after the war in rural production areas of the countries. It was a necessity at the time, but afterwards it evolved in a different manner towards these big labor actions, collective actions, and this social collectiveness that is different in a way. But its outcome is not totalitarianism, it's liberalism. In the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, it did not have outcome impetus, and it's not a good comparison. It's kibbutz on one of the aspects. We have disposal of work, nationalization of property, then I think that this is a problematic argument in the sense that you're connecting this as a causative relation between collectiveness and the totalitarianization of the society. These are, I would say, two different issues. But again, this depends on, if you say it was necessary, I would say it depends. For someone it was necessary, and for others it wasn't. And if you look at the propaganda in Romania, for example, I saw it recently during their fascist regime. It was really represented in a positive sense as collective work, very, very similar to the socialist period, as I would say. This link, I don't know if the totalitarian system is the right term or beneficial, but related to the collectivity of work, I think there are linkages between these two systems. One is a national, one is a socialist. But there are certain great similarities if you look at it in practice, how it was represented. There's a hand over there. I would just like to add, because the parallel was open between forced work during occupation in fascism and some elements of forced work that we can labor that we can find in Yugoslavia during socialist system. I think that these parallels are not possible because of a key reason. Forced labor during occupation was based on private property. Those that were working, it was based on private property, whereas while there was occupation and fascism, we did not question private property at all. So people working in Germany were not working for the German government, but for private companies or for private farmers and so on. So there is a classic form of exploitation of work here, in which labor is to enable surplus value that will go to the capital owner, and the least of the to the worker, the one performing the work. In socialism, there are forms of private labor too, and we cannot forget that. Or actually, I think this is a key analytical concept that the entire Second World War and then what is called the immediate period of national democracy before the war represents a period of fierce conflicts of revolution and counter-revolution, because these are the key elements that, in my opinion, from the American and French bourgeois revolution, the entire European history is summarized in the conflict between the revolution and the counter-revolution. And the relation towards the property is the key that defines it. As now, since 1989, when after the breakdown of socialist systems and the revisionism that we are talking about, the example you gave in Norway, where the majority of people were partisans in one way or another, people with different ideologies than clerical, that is, using them as victims for clerical propaganda, is this new wave of counter-revolution since 1989, when actually with the solution of socialist countries, we have this counter-revolution wave, which is the most visible in these linkages between nationalism and privatization, with nationalism serving for nationalization, and after this wave we have this weakening of this wave of nationalism today. And it is similar analysis to what was going on during the war and after the war in socialist Yugoslavia. Yes, in socialist Yugoslavia there was repression, there were forms of forced labor, but their foundation was revolutionary, which is totally different than the counter-revolutionary fascist basis that caused World War II. And I think that today, in historiography, that such an approach that I presented here, especially in Western European, is getting more importance, because these theories of totalitarianism have been overcome in the 70s. This is an attempt to equalize Stalinism and fascism, although they have different foundations. Fascism was defending private property. It attempted, the first law that was adopted by Hitler in 1933 was the loan privatization, and a number of historians considered that the rise of National Socialism and Hitler was supported by the capital, not only German, but more broadly. The famous historian that wrote Stalin's biography mentions this, but in this sense we can say, of course, that in socialism there was forced labor, there was repression, but its foundations are completely different, and it cannot be compared in any way with forced labor and repression, neither in scope or in the aim, as it was during fascism. So I think this cannot be compared. Forced labor in as the need of German war economy, and forced labor in elements and limited scope. It's also a topic that has not been investigated and does not exist in historiography, but conceptually I think this comparison is impossible. I apologize if I have taken too much time. Maybe we should say something about this. Okay, you opened the topic for a new conference now. So first I would say I don't see great differences. You can speak about motives, why you are making people do for nothing, work for nothing. But these Norwegians worked for the government. Yugoslavs in Norway did not work for private companies. So this is one of the aspects. Saying that it cannot be compared, I am deal in comparative analysis, and one of the aspects of it is to look at both similarities and differences. I don't see why we cannot compare. It's another thing if we say that it's not the same thing, but we can compare it. But as for the scope and the size, you're talking about Stalinism. There were quite a few million people that died of it. I'm not very sure that this argument, in my opinion, you are mixing or mistaking motive and effect of forced labor. We may say that motives can be different because the man who is forced to work day and night, I don't know if this is a big difference for him. It's a question of level of analysis and approach to this topic. Maybe we can talk more about this later.
I believe it's quite wrong to say forced labor during the Second World War or under occupation in the context of property relations, ownership relations in war and around war. There was a series of mainly German companies, private companies, which de facto worked for the German state. So the all individual work and work of companies in the war conditions were subjected to the needs of the German state. So a company making, for example, boots or shoes couldn't say, okay, now we'll make women's shoes because it's better marketed than boots for the Wehrmacht because they pay us less. We would earn less. No. A private company could work, it earned, but it was known who it was obliged to work for. Everything was subjected to the state needs. So even if it's a private company, a capitalist company, it works for the state needs. So in the end, it doesn't really make any difference who runs it, whether it's the state or the company owners who de facto are working for the state. There is a repatriation of profit. The profit leaves Germany. Private profit exported from Germany, they later enable many of those who were in Germany to have a future outside Germany. So the German state, the fascist state, whatever it was like, didn't have full control over the profit, so profit would leave Germany. It is a scientifically established fact. Profit is important. It's a financial capital. I think certainly, please, really briefly, because it will stay 3 days. It's really provocative, but in any case, it's a triangle between the worker, the capital, and the state, which makes the economy a state economy. It was present in many countries, and also in the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, as a good deal of the real socialism countries later. These three variables, when we connect them, we see that there were there was a European triangle, global triangle of liberal capitalism countries and fascism and the world of socialism. So at some point, and on the one side there was the Soviet Union, and so to say liberal democracies, and in a really perverse game, everything boiled down to the interpretation where there is a totalitarian world in subsequent interpretations, and on the other side, this world of socialism. So we should never simplify this triangle of socialist countries, the world of liberal democracy, and the world of fascism. These are ideologies that existed, and we still see the effects in its forms, and we can compare them. Okay. Okay, now at 5:34, with 4 minutes delay, we can close this symposium. I'd like to thank all the guests, the technicians and translators. And behind every successful symposium, there is a good organizer. In this case, it was Jasmina. I look for